Welcome to Athletes, Entrepreneurs, the Alumni Journey. I'm Rob Finkelstein, founder and CEO of Alumni Direct. We've created a platform to help athletes and other alumni network and connect with each other and tap into various resources in health and finance and career. But more importantly, this episode of Athletes, Entrepreneurs, Alumni Journey, it's all about athletes transitioning out of sport. We interview former college and professional athletes and we talk about their journey ultimately into successful business leadership and entrepreneurship. So excited today to have Jess Cerra on. How you doing, Jess?
I'm well, thanks. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, great. It's a pleasure. So Jess's background, she was athletic growing up and all that. She went to school at the University of Montana and then went to San Diego State and started finding a love for cycling. And ultimately, she became a professional cycler, started on the Xterra Tour. She was a U.S. national champion, amateur champion, then got to the professional ranks. Ultimately, injury kind of took it away from her. She did get back into it a little bit later. She was first, the triathlons, and then just got into cycling. But then she got into the entrepreneurial world, and she had started her personal chef company where she did different types of events, but then developed an energy bar that was very successful. Ultimately, got sold to a company called SaltStick, and today she's the VP of Development, Business Development, and Quality at SaltStick, and just taking it to another level. So Jess, I always like to talk about growing up playing sports. How did that shape you leading up to college?
So that was a great intro. A lot to unpack there. So I grew up in Whitefish, Montana, and probably a pretty unknown town while I was growing up, but now it's a hot spot. It's nestled right outside of Glacier National Park, and people live here to be active outside. So I grew up playing softball and volleyball and just your typical kind of ball sports in middle school and high school, but definitely leaned more towards being outside, hiking, and those types of things.
And that's how you got into cycling ultimately. And how did it kind of shape you just as far as just your personality and everything else kind of leading up to once you went to college?
Great question. So when I went to the University of Montana, like you said, for undergrad, and you're 2.5 hours from Whitefish, you're still kind of surrounded by the same people, similar community, similar environment. And I think really when I noticed how it shaped me was when I moved to California and went to grad school in San Diego. And I definitely felt a little out of place because there's just so much open space out in Montana, and that doesn't exist in California. So I was seeking something in California, and I noticed when I moved there that everyone was riding bikes. Like there was bikes everywhere on the road, on the Highway 101. And I was drawn to that, and it piqued my curiosity what that could look like. And that was before I even had an opportunity to start cycling. I kind of was drawn to that sport.
Okay, that's great. And then one thing we always talk about is ultimately the athlete transition out of sport. And I know, like in college, you weren't playing sports. Ultimately, you became after college. Did you notice when you were at school? Maybe I'm sure you were in touch with other athletes and all that. Was there education on transition out of sport ultimately, as far as and not just like a 1 day class, or whether it was at Montana or San Diego? Did you see any of that?
I feel like I'm a little bit blind to that aspect from the collegiate level. And I knew athletes coming out of the University of Montana, Ben Hoffman and Lindsay Corbin, who were both professional Ironman triathletes, very successful, came out of that school. But I don't know that I was really paying attention to that. When I started to notice it was when I became a professional road cyclist and I was in the Peloton. And basically the women's side of the Peloton and the men's side of the Peloton is so different. I think a lot of women do what I do, where we kind of have that platform of like school and developing a career first as a means of survival. And then we get into sport. And also, peaking later in life for women is a benefit. And so it's not frowned upon to be in your 30s and having a cycling career. If you're a guy in your 30s in road cycling, you might as well be 80 years old. So that's where I really started to notice it. It's almost like the inverse. But on the side for guys, you don't see it as much. In the women's Peloton, you see women who already have PhDs like me, or business owners, or doing other things. And you just don't see it as much on the men's side. And I think it's because they are younger. I can say from the experience of my husband went to UCLA. And that's where he found cycling. And they had a club program. And he spent 4 years racing for that club team and then graduated and still races professionally. And he went back and was the sort of director of that team. And I worked with the women's team for 2 years. And in that experience, I can say that from the standpoint of UCLA and how that's structured, I mean, that's such a good school, and there's such an emphasis on sport and being in the classroom and what the next step is afterwards. So I experienced at that level what you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's great. And you do always hear things about UCLA, especially like from an athletic standpoint. I mean, even going back to, I read the audio book of John Wooden, and one thing
Mhm.
that really talks about there is just coaches and how they kind of take care of their athletes and look at them. A lot of people, a lot of the stories about these athletes, like many years later, still reaching out to Coach Wooden and him helping in different areas. And I think you're right from a perspective of women's sports and some of the men's sports too that aren't as prominent, like I say, at a professional level. It just seems like there's more of a game plan that when you are done, which is going to happen at some point,
Mhm.
you're kind of preparing for it, like you're talking about. So I think that's important, and it should be important, obviously, across any sport. And I think it's great what UCLA is doing, and I think more schools are starting to do it. But I think it's important for them to add that into the curriculum. It's just really helping athletes in just different areas of transition out of sport, knowing that you still have another 30, 40, 50 years when you're done
Right.
in some type of career in life, that they should pay attention to that. So let's kind of talk a little bit about networking, connecting. It's so important. Talk about doing that, especially while you're still in your sport.
Yeah, I think that's such a relevant topic now. It's almost more important or equally as important as results now in the world of cycling, and specifically on the gravel side, which is it's a massive discipline now. It's growing. The UCI has adopted gravel, and most of the riders who are doing that discipline call themselves privateers and depend on networking. So when I was on a professional team, we always had media training and we learned how to interact with sponsors. At the time, social media was new. I mean, maybe two people on my first team had Instagram. We all had Facebook. And so that sort of grew while I was racing. But I think now that sort of networking and developing a brand for yourself inside a team, or if you're a privateer, is incredibly valuable. It can also lead to opportunities post mortem, right? Like once you're retired in your sport and you move on. I know a lot of people that have carved out a space in a certain brand or company. And so I think you have to be a little bit scrappy because everybody's competing for the same brands. And we've been in a world over the last 5 years that, it's been a little bit unpredictable. And going through COVID, I think everyone learned a lot. So it's those human relationships that really, really matter at the end of the day now. And I think it takes the pressure off of some athletes, but it frustrates other athletes that really just want to focus on training, eating, sleeping, and performance. And they're like, well, I also have to do the Instagram machine and all the things that go along with it. So there's kind of two sides to it. It's fascinating. And I think it'll be interesting to see like how that continues to progress as new platforms become available.
Yeah, I think it's so important because just tapping into, like I always talk about, is even starting as far back as high school, because you're whatever the different sports you're playing, you have teammates, their parents, coaches. I think there's availability there for to get to know people and build these relationships, which is key. And it's all about the relationships and also about giving back and helping, kind of in that pay it forward mentality. And I can definitely see it, like you're saying, like that networking within the cycling community is probably so important. Do you see opportunities or where people from the cycling community, let's say, are networking across other athletic communities, like different sports?
Yeah, that's a good question. Cycling is such an insular sport that I guess athlete to athlete, you see it a little bit. But what you do see is networking across non endemic sponsors or brands more often. I don't necessarily see a lot of networking or collaboration between different sports. I think everyone's so obsessed when they're racing full time that like you kind of forget like, oh yeah, there's like Ironman triathletes over here and professional runners. But I think athletes are learning that bringing in non-endemic sponsors, brands, relationships can be valuable. I learned that when we founded our gravel event up here in Whitefish. That sort of cross collaboration on the local and regional level, and then even beyond that, in making those connections. You also find something that's really beautiful in the sport of cycling, and I'm sure it's like this in other sports, like a mission. Like with our gravel race, we have a nonprofit and we fundraise to provide scholarships to local women. It's very personal to me because I depended on local scholarships to go to college. But if you have a mission associated with your brand or your event or whatever you're doing, it's very surprising how it doesn't just receive regional support. And that can really be another pathway for that sort of networking where you would be reaching other athletes, a lot of brands. The topic of education, almost everybody has a story, of something special or meaningful to them. And so it becomes very personal to other people. And so I think as far as like giving back, that's something that I think you can bring a lot of different people and communities together with a central mission.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that a lot of times I talk about just, athletes have the same DNA, a lot of the same skill set. I mean, by different sports, but still, I think there's that camaraderie. A lot of
Hmm.
most people started playing sports when they were young. They went all the way through. So I think a lot of they understand each other through the different sports and have the characteristics, the leadership, the preparation, the teamwork, everything that goes along with that. So I think when you see that cross networking, like I'll talk about, like I talk to NFL players, and they kind of NFL players, Major League Baseball, and NBA, they might kind of silo themselves, except at the upper level. Like I think the top tier athletes, you see them, connecting with each other, different sporting events and all that. But I think there's a
Hmm.
dynamic there that they should definitely tap into. I know my personal example of it. We do a monthly networking event for my podcast guests, and it's always cool to see different. It'd be like, let's say yourself would be a cyclist, or maybe a Major League Baseball player, soccer player, swimmer, but it's athletes across all sports. But it's just good to see everybody rolls up the sleeves and say, let's how do we help each other with our businesses,
Right.
which I think is so important, that people should tap into.
I
So
would like to see more of that in the sport of
yeah,
cycling because I believe that a rising tide carries all ships, right? But there's a lot of protectiveness because the resources are so limited and they're not very stable right now. And so you kind of, I don't want to call it like hoarding of resources, but you don't see a lot of that networking. And I think the model of cycling in general, cycling teams, events, how, programs are run, it could stand for a little bit of a refresh where people are working more together. But see, it's easy to say that when you're retired and you're not depending on those things as much anymore.
well, here it is. So you heard it here. Jess and I are going to collaborate on this, and we're gonna create that cycling community, and really work together to foster that networking connecting, which is so important. So that kind of leads me to the next question, and it's related again somewhat to networking connecting, but let's talk about alumni engagement. So obviously we could talk about two sides of it. One, just in general, like from your alumni perspective, maybe from a college perspective, but then also from the cycling communities. Maybe just touch real quick on college alumni and how that might funnel into your world.
Right, like specifically myself as an alum.
Yeah, from the schools that you want to.
It's interesting that I feel like I was more of an alum, like I contributed more back to UCLA even though I didn't go to school there, but it was because they had that cycling club and that opportunity. And I wish I had had that opportunity like specifically at Montana. But I guess a lot of the girls who receive our scholarships from our event are going to schools in Montana. A lot of them go to the University of Montana. So from that perspective, I feel like I have really good ties with the high schools and the colleges here through that. As far as an alum through the sport and through cycling teams, you hit on this. I love reading the stories of athletes who are retired and they want to come back. And like you hear the story all the time, right? Like so many people helped me. so many people helped me with equipment and advice and traveling. And like now I'm like in that place of my life where I can contribute it back. And I love hearing those stories. And I feel like most people get to that point. And it's a really important piece of the sport to keep it going and kind of bring up the younger generation.
Yeah, and I think it's more and more you want to get that engagement and bring the athletes back. Like I guess from back from the like the coaching perspective, and when you and your husband were involved at UCLA from a coaching standpoint, was there did you have any efforts of trying to bring back alumni, let's say, from that program, to kind of talk to the current athletes there?
Yeah, there were other alumni that would come back in. UCLA, they actually organize an event every year that's a race. And so there's quite a few alum that are involved in helping to organize and fundraise for that race. We would have like guest riders or I can think of other scenarios outside of this team where people come back in and they've gone on and became a nutritionist or something that is very relevant to the program and will come back and share that knowledge.
Yeah, I think a lot of people want to come back and mentor and work with the athletes. And I talk to different people from different schools. Have different, schools are doing different things, but it's kind of like it's a two-way street, obviously. I mean, the school needs to reach out, the athletes need to want to come back, but to be able to work together. And even then, it gets back to that cross sport. I was talking to somebody on a podcast recently, and it was refreshing to hear that their school are bringing alumni back to mentor, but it's not specific just to their sport. So in
Hmm.
other words, like for me as a runner, I might come back and mentor people at University of Delaware, football players. I mean, what's the difference? I mean, like I'm mentoring as somebody that's been there, was through the athletic program, is in the real world now, and can hopefully add value back to them. Give me some thoughts on that as far as mentoring across sports.
Yeah, definitely mentoring across sports and hearing perspectives from different industries, different backgrounds in the sport. And to touch on what you were saying earlier, sort of having like a program that this could be a way to have that program for athletes. It could be through alumni where you get like a blueprint for what life is going to look like once you graduate. And a lot of that I think has nothing to do with nutrition or all of the things you're focused on, sort of that financial blueprint, taking the next steps in a career, learning how to network, learning how to make a good resume and do an interview. And like there's so many things that we could talk about and address, but I think there needs to be more of that. And it's funny because I'm asked a lot to come and talk about things, but it's always about nutrition, about SaltStick, about my career, but no one's ever asked me for like the business side of things, which would be fun to share because when I do get a chance to talk like young women, I'll talk their ears off about how empowering it is to have an education and how becoming financially stable is the gateway to living a life that you want to live and being able to afford to do sport forever.
Yeah, so we'll have to be a plant at one of these conferences and just ask those questions so we can start
Yeah.
start talking to people about it. But yeah, I think it's important. I mean, that whole education piece. I think it's a differentiator too with the school. I mean, I know I talked to one guy who was just like, "Hey, I really wish I would have had like a 6 week workshop or a mandatory class that I had to take, and it would have
Hmm.
made a difference." Because you just hear all these stories of these athletes transition out of sport that they were so zoned in a sport, sometimes understandable, and maybe on scholarship, football, whatever the sport might be,
Right.
and they just don't take the time to do the other things and learn. So then when they're done, all of a sudden, back to the financial literacy in other areas, they're not um, you know in tune to those areas that if they would have had the education would have made a difference.
Yeah. I definitely agree that's a it's one of those things that it seems like it's no fun to focus on when you're fast and young and training a lot, but it becomes so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk. Bring this up different times but I'm interested regarding the cycling community. Is there any movement in NIL, name, image, likeness, as far as getting some of these cyclists different? Not the whole portal thing and all that a lot of people talk about in NIL, but more so about just the sponsored deals, specific to the cycling athletes.
Yeah, it's kind of multi-dimensional based on the disciplines. Like I was saying, gravel has adopted sort of the same model as mountain biking, where you are that privateer and you create your own team around you with sponsors. The road racing world is very different. And oftentimes within a team, you aren't even allowed to talk to the sponsors that sponsor the team. And you certainly aren't allowed to have your own individual sponsors. Occasionally, some of the better riders on the team will bring in, like they have such a big brand, like Demi Vollering, who is one of the best female cyclists in the world right now. She has a partnership with Nike that she's brought into her team because she's a brand herself. Um, and so that sort of thing is allowed when it can really help lift the whole team up. But it is, again, yeah, one of those things where you're really limited in the sport of road racing to having that opportunity.
So now I don't know if you got a chance to listen or watch any of the podcasts, but here's the fun questions I always like to ask. First one is, if you can go back in time, 10 words or less, what advice would you give the freshman at Montana, Jess?
Okay. I already know that I know the answer to this because I would know that I was going to experience a bunch of injuries all in a row that significantly changed the course of my career. I would listen to my first director, Mari Holden, who's an Olympian and a world champion. And she used to always say, have the courage to rest. Rest is so powerful and so hard to do. It is unplanned rest, I think, is the hardest interval that an athlete will ever do. And you have to get to a certain level of maturity. So Jess, 10 years later, was mature enough to tell younger Jess, rest, you can rest. It's going to be okay. Like, you're going to come through this. And that would 100% have been my advice. Would I have listened? Debatable.
And then how about fast forward, like advice that you would have given to senior Jess?
Senior in college,
Yeah.
I think I would have said, go for it. Don't be afraid. Go for it. Take the risk. And if you're willing to work hard at anything, there's always going to be someone who's willing to meet you there because hard work attracts other people that like to work hard. And so if you're willing to put your whole heart into it and do that really hard work, you'll find that support around you.
Yeah, there you go. Great advice. So let's fast forward. So you got into this cycling career. You mentioned you had some injuries and all that. Let's kind of talk about ultimately your transition out of sport. Again, you said it was great because you prepared, you had your education and all that. And you were a little older as a professional athlete. On the women's side, like you said, there tend to be more female athletes older in this sport.
Mm-hmm.
But talk about your transition, maybe what you went through in being done, so to speak. I mean, I'm sure you still cycle, but I mean, the competitive side of things.
Kind of two stages to that. In 2019, my energy bar business was growing rapidly. We had an opportunity with REI, became a national brand, and it became apparent to me that I could no longer race full time and operate that business. So I decided that that would be my last year of racing professionally on the road. And in hindsight, what a gift that my business was growing at that time, because I know so many other people that were going to race one more year or 2 more years. And then COVID really stole that away from people and the whole scene changed. A lot of race organizations folded, a lot of teams folded. So the timing for me was great. And I decided that I was going to start pursuing gravel a little bit because I had created so many relationships with brands, whether it was through my teams or through my bar business or my cooking services. I had done a lot of events for big cycling brands. So it was easy for me to create sort of like a small privateer schedule for gravel. And I started doing that. And then, of course, COVID impacted that. And when we kind of came through it, at that point, JoJ, the bar company, had been acquired by the SaltStick brand. And I was working full time now for that company. And I decided this is no longer going to be a full time thing for me. This is just a passion. I started the gravel race the year after COVID in 2021 and was also really leaning into spending time directing that. So it was kind of like this, like two phases that felt very natural very easy for me. It felt more like an evolution of who I was. And I am so grateful for that because I think that's somewhere where people really struggle with their identity when you leave sport, not just the things that we've been talking about, the financial side and the career side, but you just kind of don't recognize who you are. And I was so busy through that time that I didn't even have time to breathe and think about it. So for me, it was a really great experience. Yeah, it also goes back to what I was saying. When you work when you work really hard, my experience has been that people want to work with you.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it sounds like yeah, being busy certainly helps too, and then having the success that you did. So, what advice would you give to athletes in general about transitioning into sport?
Yeah, I think it starts before you transition out. And I think that's the key. And I give this advice all the time because you see when people have a devastating injury in a season and they're just lost. And I know this because I've been there. Like I was saying before, I was mature enough where I dealt with injury in what I think was an unhealthy way, where I just felt very negative all the time, was always comparing what I was going through to everyone else having a great season, looking through a narrow lens. And once I started my bar business and I started to get busy, when I had my injuries later on in my career, I was so poured into that I had something else to focus on. So I know it's not realistic for every athlete to have a full-time job or to be running a business, but I think whatever it is for you to find that something that gives you meaning and that is truly something that makes you excited other than just riding a bike. It could be volunteering at an animal shelter, it could be something in the industry, whatever it is, find that early, have that so you understand what it feels like to have something else that has meaning. And that is really, that can sort of be that sort of like beacon point, that light for you when you transition out, because you already can visualize what that feels like.
Yeah, I mean that's just great advice. I mean, I think having that solution with the plan and just knowing what you're going to do in the future, I think that certainly helps out. So let's talk about now. So you went through the whole entrepreneurial journey with the bar, and then ultimately landed at SaltStick and when they acquired you. Talk about some of the great things that you're doing at SaltStick today.
Yeah, so I'm the vice president of product development. So I really am like, I'm the starting point for the good ideas. And so I work across all of our manufacturers at SaltStick. And just to give a little background for people who don't know the brand, we're an electrolyte company, and we serve anyone from the elite athlete to the performance pursuer. And we have several products, but we have a really unique product called the Fast Chew, and it's like a sweet tart. You chew it and it absorbs through your mouth, and that goes directly into your bloodstream. And so, one thing that I've led recently was we did some clinical research with Western Colorado University. And this goes back to my sort of exercise physiology background, where we actually wanted to show how our product worked and how quickly it worked. And we were able to show that 50% of the electrolytes can absorb through your mouth in the first 45 seconds. So there's that side of my job of really the product development, scientific validity, efficacy of our product, to the more creative side, where I draw from my chef experience. And I think that I am really good with flavors. And I think that's somewhere where I shine. And we've created some energy chews that have fun flavors like the OMG, which is orange mango guava.
Good.
Yep, it's pretty good. We have a sour blue raspberry chew that has a sour dust around it. Those are all products that I've worked on. And then kind of coming full circle from that ideation to working on the research and development and bringing that product to market, on the other side of it, running the quality program. When an athlete picks up a bottle and sees that it's informed sport or informed choice certified, I'm the person at the company making sure that all of that's legitimate and that everything behind the scenes is being tested, and that we're holding that standard to our brand and the integrity of our products. So it's I've just been so busy and I've been able to learn a lot and grow a lot in this role. So it's incredibly rewarding in that sense, because I think as a former athlete, if you're not being challenged and kind of a little uncomfortable, you're more uncomfortable. Like you kind of need that in your life a little bit. And so being in a company where you're growing and you're pushing to innovate and yeah, having a brand that you feel incredibly proud of, yeah, it takes a lot of work.
Is it a when you say chewable? Is it kind of like so like a hard like you say like the sweet tart like a hard consistency or more of like a gummy type consistency?
So we have the fast chews, which is that tablet sweet tart consistency. So you can suck on it or you can chew it. I sent you samples. They probably are going to arrive tomorrow, of course.
Right. So we'll have to do a follow up to talk
We'll
about
have
how
to
great
do a
they are.
that's the rule there. I was hoping they would arrive before we recorded. And then we have our electrolyte gummy that is, like the chewy gummy consistency. Our claim to fame with that is that they don't stick to your teeth, which is kind of a big deal. You probably have eaten a fair share of energy gummies in your life. So yeah, those are just two examples of our product lines.
Okay, great. Good deal. And then last question, you have a passion project, a nonprofit. Talk a little about that.
Yeah, so my husband Sam and I started the Last Best Ride, our gravel event in 2021. And I mentioned earlier, growing up here was came from a very low income family. And we had so much community support in this little community. Everybody really looks out for each other. And when it came time to start applying for college, our guidance counselor, Mrs. Mansfield, came into our classroom when I was a junior and started talking about it. And so I went to visit her and kind of freaked out when I learned how much it was going to cost. And she worked with me over the next year through my junior and early into my senior year to apply for, fill out my FAFSA, apply for federal funding, and then also apply for all of the local scholarships. And I won so many local scholarships that those alone almost paid for my entire undergrad. And pretty much like I would say that I was more mature than your average high school senior just because when you kind of grow up in a situation where you're really having to help your family out too, you mature a little faster. And I knew I was like, I'm coming back somehow. I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I'm going to have a scholarship one day and I'm going to help girls like me. And the gravel race was the conduit to creating that nonprofit and helping with the fundraising. So for 4 years, it was fully volunteer run. No one was paid. And all of the proceeds went to the scholarship. So I sold the race for this year and we're still collaborating with that director, but we're in year 5. I'm headed to one of the high school scholarship evenings tonight and I'll start giving out. We have nine recipients this year across 5 high schools, and it will be at $130,000 that we've given out in the last 5 years. And I should have mentioned the scholarship is named after my guidance counselor.
That's awesome. I mean, there's always that story that you hear that one person that was influential in your life, and that sounds great. What an amazing tribute to her. So, how can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm Jess Cerra. Sarah is spelled Cerra, at Jess Cerra on Instagram, Jess Cerra on Facebook. You can also find me on the SaltStick Instagram at SaltStick. I do some Instagram lives over there, and you'll see me featured in some of our brand videos. And then if you head over to the SaltStick website, occasionally you'll see a picture of me pop up in some of the branding too. But yeah, I encourage people to follow along on both platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can find us at alumnidirect.com and the podcast, Athletes and Entrepreneurs, the Alumni Journey. We're on the Alumni Direct YouTube channel as well as across all the different podcast networks, Spotify, etc. And just really encourage people to watch and listen each week. I mean, just such great content. I mean, amazing advice and just hearing the stories of our guests like Jess. And definitely want people doing that. We always say if we can impact at least one person, but obviously want to impact a lot more. So, Jess, thank you so much. It's been great.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.